A beautiful Texas socialite and entrepreneur was poisoned with strychnine in October of 1987. It was in the bottle of NyQuil she relied on to fall asleep. Patsy Bolton Wright was one of the owners of Texas's Great Southwest Historical Wax Museum. An arsonist set fire to the wax museum less than a year after she was murdered. Neither crime has ever been solved. What happened to Patsy Wright? The Great Southwest Wax Museum was bustling with excitement on October 22, 1997, as they prepared for their annual Halloween event. The dress rehearsal was that night, and it was one of the most successful events of the year. Patsy Wright, one of the museum's owners, was happy with the outcome. She returned home after a long day at work, and after eating and watching some TV, she got ready for bed. To improve her sleep, she took an over-the-counter cold drug called NyQuil as part of her nightly ritual. This was something she had been doing for years and was joked about frequently between her and her close friends and family. A stickler for sticking to the regimen, this night was unlike any other, and Patsy took the NyQuil before turning in for the night. However, just minutes after taking the drug, Patsy became seriously unwell. Patsy made a panicked phone call to her sister Sally shortly before 3 a.m. Sally's husband, Patsy's brother-in-law, Steve, answered the phone. Patsy asked to speak to her sister, and when she came to the phone, she heard Patsy's feeble voice saying, "I've taken some NyQuil, and something's really, really wrong." Sally and Steve immediately contacted the emergency services. Because the dispatcher couldn't send an ambulance and she didn't have Patsy's address, Patsy was in the process of renovating a new home and was renting while the work was being done. The pair called the police department to find out Patsy's address, and once they got it, Steve and Sally rushed in the car and sped the few miles to Patsy's house on Holm Oak Street, nearly colliding with another car in the process. Sally didn't have a key to the front door, which was locked. Patsy had told her sister recently that the spare key that she had kept on the double oven had vanished, and she hadn't gotten around to getting a replacement. So Steve went in through a small bedroom window that Patsy had left cracked and let Sally in through the front door. Patsy's burglar alarm had not been activated. She had put one in after someone had shattered her windows. The pair noted that the activation wasn't set as odd. Patsy had a lot of valuables in the home, and it wasn't like her to leave herself so open. Patsy, dressed in pink pajamas, was found by Steve and Sally laying on her king-size waterbed as if she had passed out. Her eyes were open, but she couldn't see. Sally dialed 911 for an update on when they would get here, and Steve later told the authorities that he had moved a table with 2 plates away from the bed and began performing CPR. When we arrived at the residence, we went straight to the front door. The door was, of course, locked, and we couldn't get in. She was in the bedroom when we arrived. She simply appeared to have passed out. That, I reasoned, was what happened. So we tried to wake her up, but it wasn't working. During that, a lot of green fluid came up from her, and I would continually spit that out onto the bed, where there was a towel there as I remember. Sally's husband, Steve, said. The medics arrived shortly after that. One of the Lifestar paramedics on duty that night, Randy Jones, says that there was nothing they could do. Patsy's eyes were beginning to dilate and she had no pulse or blood pressure. She was being transported to Arlington Memorial Hospital, where she was pronounced dead at 4:15 a.m. by Dr. Tim Williams. Before leaving, patrolman Patrick Bridges took a bottle of NyQuil from her restroom and placed it in an evidence bag. No one suspected foul play at first. Patsy, on the other hand, had acknowledged taking cold medicine immediately before being ill in her phone call. Patsy's children, family, and friends mourned her awful and sudden death the next day. Leslie, her daughter, was taken aback when she received the news. "You'd never expect it to happen. She was so vibrant, so healthy. There was nothing wrong with her. And when it happened, you were taken aback because you never anticipated it to happen to her." A standard autopsy was done 8 days after Patsy's memorial ceremony. Patsy's blood samples were tested for 56,000 distinct foreign chemicals by the lab technician. Suddenly, the gadget elicited a ferocious affirmative response. The chemical was quickly identified as strychnine. When the medical examiner realized just what had killed Patsy, he called the lead investigator on the case. "Do you have a seat?" the medical examiner asked before saying, "It's been 20 years since I've seen anything like this." Strychnine poisoning is regarded as an extremely painful way to die due to its horrifying side effects. Patsy was poisoned with pure powder strychnine, the most potent form of the poison available. Strychnine is only sold in a few places, and all sales are regulated by the federal government. Authorities are hoping that someone can recall a questionable sale that occurred around Patsy's death. Strychnine poisoning is also a rare occurrence. The Arlington, Texas authorities confronted a perplexing dilemma in the murder of Patsy Wright. How had this hazardous chemical entered Patsy's bloodstream? Because strychnine is difficult to obtain and its sale is carefully regulated by the government, cases of strychnine poisoning are extremely rare in today's world. Because no strychnine sales were linked to Patsy's murder, it seemed likely that the poison was stolen or bought on the underground market. Patsy was probably poisoned by someone who was familiar with her habit of taking NyQuil when she couldn't sleep. Many people were considered potential suspects in Patsy's murder, including her 2 children, her first ex-husband, and her ex-boyfriend. However, the majority of them cooperated with the inquiry and passed polygraph tests. Investigators honed down on 2 suspects in particular. Authorities ruled out product tampering and advised Patsy's family to consider whether she killed herself and laced the NyQuil herself. Patsy Wright, on the other hand, looked to have everything going for her. She had 2 children with whom she shared a close relationship. Sally, Patsy's sister, was a successful businesswoman. They were owners of 2 wax museums valued at millions of dollars. Patsy had also recently purchased 3 quarter horses and intended to train them herself. Her family rejected any attempts by authorities to claim it was a suicide, and the closer they examined the evidence, the more inclined they were to believe. Arlington Police Sergeant Jay Gustafson initiated an investigation into Patsy's death as a homicide. He had 2 hints that led him to believe that the killer was someone Patsy knew well. First, on the night she died, the burglar alarm had not been activated. Second, only Patsy's closest friends were aware that she had a practice of taking nightly cold medicine before going to bed. Patsy's sister and brother-in-law were the first people Sergeant Gustafson questioned. The sergeant was on the lookout for a reason. Patsy's fortune stemmed from her joint ownership of 2 wax museums with Sally. The museums were not just tourist attractions. They were also social hubs in their individual communities. Sally and her husband Steve inherited the museums after Patsy died. In the case of Patsy Wright's murder, there were 2 main suspects according to police. Steve Horning, Patsy's brother-in-law, was the first. Patsy and her sister Sally owned 2 popular wax museums worth a combined $6 million, which Sally was expected to inherit. Patsy did not get along with Steve, who was financially irresponsible and had gotten himself into debt, despite the sisters' strong friendship. Sally had been battling cancer for the past 2 years, and while she was now in remission, Patsy was worried that if the cancer returned and took Sally's life, Steve would seize control of the museums. So, Patsy and Sally scheduled a meeting to change their life insurance policies and cut Steve off from the museums. But Patsy passed away before the meeting could take place. Sally passed a polygraph, while Steve's first polygraph resulted in an unclear result. He passed the second. One aspect that led to Steve's possible innocence was that when he found Patsy, he attempted mouth-to-mouth resuscitation on her, which could have resulted in lethal liquid passing into his own mouth. Sally and Steve also did not attempt to dispose of any evidence, even though the strychnine-laced NyQuil was discovered in Patsy's bathroom before the police arrived. Authorities believed that if Steve had poisoned Patsy, he would not have attempted to save her by administering mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, putting potentially fatal liquid into his own mouth. Steve and Sally, as well as other members of their family, volunteered to take polygraph exams. They were all successful. Bob Cox, Patsy's second ex-husband, was the second suspect. Patsy had a horrible short-lived marriage with Bob after divorcing her previous husband, who had a major gambling problem and basically lived on her money. Patsy was obliged to get a restraining order against Bob after they split because he was harassing her. Patsy was deposed at a civil trial between Bob and an insurance company years later. Bob ran a failed wax museum that burned down, and the insurance company assumed Bob was the one who ignited the fire. Bob tried to persuade Patsy to lie in her evidence because she knew a lot of unfavorable information about her ex-husband, but she refused. Patsy was poisoned only 10 days before the civil trial, and Bob was able to win the case without her testimony. Bob declined to take a polygraph test or help investigators in Patsy's murder case. There was no evidence that Bob Cox was guilty, and he maintained his innocence. However, a tray with 2 dinner plates was discovered in Patsy's bedroom, suggesting she had an intimate dinner with someone else on the night she was slain, which added to the case's complexity. Could there have been an unidentified visitor that night? Someone who knew Patsy well enough to enjoy a late-night meal with her? Patsy had a boyfriend at the time, but he was 3 hours away in Austin on that particular night. Patsy and Bob would have never had an intimate supper together in her bedroom, given their tumultuous history, leading to suspicion that Patsy's killer was a secret lover no one else knew about. However, it's also plausible that Patsy ate dinner alone on 2 separate plates, and this information is nothing more than a red herring. Patsy's death isn't the only unsolved mystery in this case, however. 2 more unusual occurrences may or may not be related to this case. Lori Ann Williams, a 26-year-old receptionist at Patsy's Wax Museum, died unexpectedly in 1984, with no cause of death ever found. Following Patsy's death, there was speculation that Williams had also been poisoned. The body of Williams was exhumed, but autopsy results were inconclusive. Patsy's Great Southwest Wax Museum burned down a year after she died. A man called Stanley Lester Pointer was captured trying to grab a ledger from the ashes 2 weeks later. Pointer was investigated as a possible suspect in both the museum fire and Patsy's death due to a prior arrest record for arson, but he was freed due to a lack of evidence. Dallas cops attempted to reinterrogate him in 1991. Pointer, on the other hand, attempted to flee the scene in his car, and because he nearly ran over a police officer in the process, the officers opened fire and killed him. Was the information of Patsy's murder kept inside the ledger, or did Pointer know something about it? And why would he risk his life to save a ledger if he didn't? Despite the greatest efforts of the investigators, Patsy Wright's murder was never solved, and the case still remains open today.